Welcome everybody. Neurocritical care, neurointensive care, neurology, neurophysiology, paleoneurology. Those are just some of the fields that we will discuss in the second part of the chapter of medicine on, off, and off the brain. And we will have further examples on how neuroscience interacts with multiple medical fields. And I would like just to start by giving you a very brief definition is too big of a word, but introduction to neurology and neurosurgery. So the first thing to keep in mind is that for a lot of these fields, the specialization might differ depending on which geocultural areas you are in. So in some cases, specialization will only happen after a full graduate program, or at least a medical program, an entry-level medical degree, so an MBBS or an MD. In some areas, they represent a separate field for which you can obtain a doctoral or postdoctoral training on its own, and so they are often understood as not just supportive of either medicine or neuroscience, but as their own field, which determines the way, for instance, in practice grants are awarded and research perspectives are constructed. But another example in this context is the interaction between fields such as neurology and neurosurgery, where in the first case you're talking about the scientific investigation of that specific part of medicine or neuroscience, and in the second case you have the medical application. So to provide a parallel, neurology, just as psychology, represents the science. Neurosurgery or psychiatry represent a specific type of a medical application. But of course, those two terms or these two diets are interconnected by very definition. So again, this will be one of those weeks where you see less of me, as if you needed that, and more slides as I'm talking about different topics. So bear with me. I'll do my best to make sure that every slide or every description, every diagram corresponds with what I'm saying at the time. I'll try to combine those things. But of course, you can always stop the video or slow down the video at any point to better grasp certain concepts. Also, I want to mention a few things. In terms of preparing for the quizzes, this chapter and the following chapter are so full of materials, names, labels, and scientific experiments that it's really hard to master everything. So I will do my best to make sure that I am only going to talk about those things that you need to remember for the quizzes, for the assignments, despite the fact that I really encourage you to review the chapter in its entirety to better grasp its connection between different labels, different experiments. So what will be one of the areas to begin our conversation here in this section of medicine on, off, and off the brain that focuses on, again, the practical application of neuroscience in a medical field? Well, I would say that epilepsy is probably one of the best examples. So what is epilepsy? Why is it important to discuss in neuroscience, but even more so in the context of critical neuroscience? And why is it relevant? Because of its etiology, related diagnostic and prognostic features, its representation in a scientific field, as well as in a social, cultural, and I dare to say even media-related field. Epilepsy has always been connected in the context of medical anthropology, for instance, to this sort of transcendental element. It was also nicknamed sacred disease, to give an example. And there are plenty of accounts where epilepsy is connected to what we would otherwise label, possibly in a very judgmental and imprecise sense, as mystical experiences or mystical encounters. So how much truth is there? Can we say that epilepsy is the main cause for these transcendental, out-of-body, mystical, religious, spiritual experiences? Or can we say that we are possibly, again, tossing the baby with the bathwater? We just conflating these two elements into one, as if epilepsy contains a causal factor as opposed to be a correlate or underpinning what's happening maybe in a non-bodily situation. Those are all things that we'll discuss, and it's also important to understand that this is yet a problem, because the assumption is that you will find something in the body that will justify the presence and the process, so the way epilepsy starts and develops over time. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I keep stressing the fact that working on evidence-based science is a good thing, is the primary way to approach this problem. And so to some extent, while I understand where this perspective comes from, I don't fully embrace it, the perspective according to which neuroscience is becoming more and more neurologized, so to speak. Or even psychiatry is becoming too neurologized, becoming too neuroscience-based. And this is a perspective that we find in other volumes, textbooks about critical neuroscience. I just think about Chorin Slaby, for instance, and there was, those books that were published in the last 10 years or so. Again, critical neuroscience is a brand new field, and so there are only a few solidly based textbooks that will be one of such textbooks. So is it a bad thing that psychiatry and neuroscience as a discourse are becoming more and more embedded from this perspective? So let's begin our conversation.
So last week we talked about clinical and medical neuroscience, and if you remember, we mentioned a few of the applications of these subfields, considering the connection between mind and body in the clinical setting. So working on addiction and behavior, as well as Alzheimer's disease, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorders, mood and personality disorders, autism, but also more medical, and by that I do not mean to say that what we said so far is less medical, but medical as separated from psychiatry specifically. So dyslexia, cataplexy, Down syndrome, epilepsy, brain tumors, Huntington disease, neurological trauma, Parkinson, multiple sclerosis, Tourette syndrome, stroke, and so on and so forth. And we also mentioned that the techniques that we previously mentioned, so EEG, MRT, MEG, TMS, and TSCS are part of the standards in clinical and medical neuroscience. Now, of course, in this context, something that I really want to encourage students to research is the importance of neurogenesis in this context. So I will just pull up an image here. It's the same image that you have on page 104 in the textbook. And this is related to, again, the process of neurogenesis. And we mentioned in the past how important that is to provide hope to patients recovering from all the previously mentioned mental and medical issues, but also to get a more scientifically accurate depiction of how our brain works and repair itself. So in this specific picture, you can see an adaptation, a reinterpretation of the neurogenetic model, and you can see that in the bottom left ventricular zone, you can observe the neural stem cells, neuroepithelial cell, and the neuron. The neuron is rendered here in silver, this dark gray, followed by the radial glial cells, and the neuron in blue and bright red, respectively, followed by type 3 cells in kind of a orangey, dark yellow, the ependymal cells in gray/pink, subventricular zone astrocyte, type 2 cell in green, and oligodendrocyte precursor cell. This one is the other one in bright orange yellow, all in the subventricular zone. Now, keep in mind that the SVZ or subventricular zone is one of these two regions where where human neurogenesis exists both in the embryonic and in the postnatal brain, the adult brain. It's a region that is situated on the outside wall of each lateral ventricle of the vertebrate brain, and contains multiple cell population, including neuroblasts and astrocyte-like cells. So, subventricular zone present both in prenatal and postnatal brain, and in a neurogenic perspective, the conceptualization of what to do and what to expect in surgery and in the post-surgical period. This is important for pretty much everything in neurocritical care and neurointensive care, which is the next part of this chapter. Again, we mentioned critical in two main ways to interpret the terms. One, critical from a philosophical perspective, and the other one more in the context of the operating room. And this has to do with multiple medical problems, some of which are more neurogenetically based to some extent, and to some other extent, they also can be trauma-related, and so presenting more mental health-related issues. And I'm thinking about strokes, seizures, intracranial edema or encephalitis, meningitis, brain tumors, and immune system related problems such as the Guillain-Barré syndrome, and possible medical complications that can be better treated in this context with multidisciplinary treatment teams, including anesthesiology, neurology, neurosurgery, where I mentioned the connection between these two terms, and emergency medicine. Now, in this regard, I also want to mention a very specific medical issue, the one of epilepsy. And you are probably familiar with some basic facts about epilepsy. The etiology of epilepsy is still unknown, and very often this problem had been framed in the past as having some either mystical in a positive sense, spiritual, or possible demonic possession-like presentation. So the very concept of a sacred disease was connected to this medical problem. So what is epilepsy specifically in the context of this sacred disease interpretation? Temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE. It is a chronic disorder of the nervous system that has this seizure, this unprovoked focal seizure presentation that are, as the name implies, located in the temporal lobe of the brain, and those seizures last about 1 to 2 minutes on average, and that is why TLE is one of the most common form of epilepsy with the focal seizures. And just as a general review, keep in mind that there are about 40 types of epilepsy, a little over 40, that are divided into two main groups: focal seizure and generalized seizure. In this context, TME, focal seizures, account for roughly 60% of all adult cases, and TLE is the most common form of them all. Now, in more modern time, this concept of a sacred disease related to this medical issue, temporal lobe epilepsy, is the very, very famous case of Pius IX, the Catholic Pope, and the claim according to which a lot, if not most, of his theology, especially late theological pronouncement, were connected to again temporal lobe epilepsy that he was suffering from. Now, of course, as usual, there are multiple interpretation and unfortunately misinterpretation of the role and value, dare to say, of TLE in the Pope's pronunciation. And of course that there is no documented evidence that Pius IX had undertaken any specific treatment for this problem. There are apparently no medical records in this context. And by apparently, I don't mean to identify anything on the conspiracy theory perspective, but also due to sheer scientific knowledge at the time. We're talking about 1870, I believe 1871, 1872, roughly. And also, the issue here is connected to the fact that, generally speaking, and there are some studies that indicate that as well, the literature supporting the fact that everything was caused by TLE tends to have a negative view of Pius IX in general, and the opposite is true for positive views of his theology, and less appreciation for the role that temporal lobe epilepsy might have had in his work and his thought process, and by definition, the spiritual connection with these pronunciations. Now, it is also important to to keep in mind that there are several of the dogmatic aspects, the dogmas that were part of papal doctrine at that time were already theoretically in place long before Pius IX had the chance to really talk and write about these theological aspects, so we cannot really use epilepsy as a justification for that. What is true and what we know based on the literature and the current record is that he indeed had partial epilepsy, which resulted from an accident that he was victim of at a young age, and a combination of anoxia and developmental anomalies that were evidenced by hemiplegia and facial asymmetry that you can notice in the photographs taken of the Pope. And of course, we can say because of that epilepsy was indeed affecting a lot of the psychological processes. Now, what it seems to be a little non-fully based on scientific evidence is that the doctrine itself was indeed caused by the epileptic seizure in this context, and of course there is stigma about epilepsy that continues to this day. And if there is a lesson to learn from the view that epileptic seizure, especially in this context, TLE, has in society, is our increased awareness of the neurological foundation, the neural underpinnings on one side, the need for a more tolerant, inclusive, and empathetic perception and support for individuals suffering from it, and also the clear distinction between experience, both personal experience as well as relational experience, societal experience on one side, and the etiological role of epilepsy, so that we don't confound these two things, we don't merge things together, claim that one is the causal factor of the other, despite the fact that we mentioned this multiple times, there are plenty of neurological evidence for at least the underpinning factor in this context. Now, I will include here some of the articles that talked about the connection between the concept of a sacred disease on one side and the current scientific evidence on temporal lobe epilepsy, and also some works that are parallel to neuroscience that stem from biology, neurobiology, and theoretical speculation on these fields. I just think of the work by Robert Sapolsky in this context, and again the clear identification with the fact that certain, let's use the term, psychiatric presentation that might be apparent in the context of an enhanced sense of the religious, spiritual, mystical, transcendental, are connected to the interest itself. So being more interested in religious themes, not with direct perception of these religious factors. And of course, but this I do not mean to say that this is not true in all cases of epilepsy, but we need to distinguish, we need to separate the perception, the sensation, the phenomenon from the noumenon of the mystical conceptualization of self. Because we could say the opposite, that there are psychiatric disorders, even outside of temporal lobe epilepsy, that by definition might help, foster, increase, enhance spirituality or religiosity in people. But we could also make the opposite claim if you want to use a reductionist perspective, namely that individuals that do not have the same level of spiritual, mystical, transcendental, religious experience might have different neurological functions. And the ultimate judgment, which one is the more proper, which one is the most rational, it's something that we cannot detect specifically outside of an interpretation of brain function. So judgment and perception, the central part of our discussion on neurocritical and neurointensive care, and specifically regarding temporal lobe epilepsy. And this, by the way, this conversation is part of the medical analysis and psychological analysis since the 1800 and 1900. Even Freud, talking about Dostoevsky, claimed that epilepsy was indeed involved in change of personality, and there's plenty of literature in the context of the connection between genius and folly, or mutation, changing to human personality due to neurological factors. In neuroscience, we mentioned the case of Phineas Gage in Vermont, as well as the less scientific and more narrative-like literature. Think about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for instance. Now, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind in a more modern sense when we talk about neurosurgery, neurocritical care, which is the connection between computational, automated, informatics-based, virtual based interventions and what the neuromedical engineering can do in terms of supporting patients affected by these type of problems. And I would like to talk about the application of medical science. Think about neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease, and most of I won't say most, but many of these research studies focus indeed on the regeneration of damaged neuronal tissues or completely lost neural tissue by the engineered version of the mechanical properties of the nervous system. Now, what does it mean? Well, it means that creating artificial electronic circuits mimicking the neural tissues is an important part of this interface, this brain-computer or neural interface structure that replicate these activities, electromagnetics, electrochemical activity in the body, and account for the possible challenges and rejection of artificial materials by the body. In this context, further research developments cover microelectrodes and optical neural interfaces with fiber optics, as well as complete microsystems to collect and modulate multiple signals and deliver them to the neural tissue. Again, this focuses on neurogenesis, neuroregeneration, neuromodulation, because this type of research focuses on the transmission delivery modality. So an artificial delivery modality versus a natural delivery modality. So amplitude and aperture, length and shape, and population of spikes of action potential in the body. So combining the chemical, electrical, magnetic, and optical signals. So production, transmission, and delivery. Now, because we mentioned neuromodulation, neuroregeneration, and neurogenesis, the main focus here is to correct and rebalance the neural functions of specific brain areas without the side effects, without negatively affecting neighboring regions or causing undesirable side effects. For instance, problems with, or rather alterations with visual spatial perception, localized or generalized pain. We mentioned the research by Ramachandran in the past, as well as more psychiatric related problems such as psychomotor agitation as well as tremor. Neurology is connected to neuroscience in general, but also neuropsychiatry and neuropsychology because they share clinical interests: agnosia, agraphesthesia, agraphia, alexia, amnesia, anosognosia, aphasia, apraxia, aprosodia, ADHD, ASD, but also Alzheimer's, dementia, dyslexia, epilepsy, psychosis, stroke, and traumatic brain injury. Another important subfield within neuroscience and medicine, discussed in this chapter, is the field of paleoneurology. What is paleoneurology? Well, paleoneurology studies the effect of the brain on the skull. Or the pressure that exerts on the innermost layer of the skull. Now, this pressure or imprint is a process called imprintation or endocast. Now, just as we mentioned earlier, in the context of the application of neural mechanisms and brain-computer interface, this virtual modeling readaptation through neuroengineering, the process of imprintation can also be replicated artificially, and this is done to support modeling on the basis of applied approaches and further developed by the implementation of computed tomography and computer algorithms, as opposed to the naturally occurring sedimentation through the cranial foramina. Now, an important aspect of this is that brains and skulls have been drawn to infer certain characteristics and traits from the very early stages of precursors of modern psychiatry and psychology within paleoneurology, but also in pseudoscientific fields. And we're talking about the history, of course, here of the developments that led to modern paleoneurology. And these pseudoscientific fields, of course, are fields such as phrenology, certain aspects of racist pseudoscientific claims within eugenics, within the eugenic movement, and to some extent also to physiognomy in this context. Now, there are several studies that address the issue with the eugenic movements, and being here in the United States, especially in Vermont, this is something that unfortunately invests our very history. And when we think about the advances in medical sciences, we have to deal with this enormous ethical baggage in the context of decision-making power of the scientific community, of the socio-political structure. And among the most evident cases of the application of eugenics, we can think of science produced and conducted scientific studies in England, here in the United States, in Germany, and Sweden. Unfortunately, up to very recent times, we're talking about the 70s here, and of course, these studies were arbitrarily decided on racist pseudoscientific claims. So to control certain characteristics that were deemed to be unwanted, unpleasant, unneeded in human offspring. So the development of paleoneurology happened in multiple stages and steps, at times through conflicting and opposed views of researchers. And we mentioned physiognomy earlier and phrenology. So just a few names here: Giambattista della Porta, Franz Gall, Johann Spurzheim, as well as Thomas Brown, Georges Cuvier, and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, all the way to Vladimir Blazek, Veronika Kochetkova, Emiliano Brunner, and Roger Sperry. Of course, in the latter cases, we're talking about general paleoneurology with Blazek and neuropsychology with Roger Sperry. I just want to clarify this, not to link this back to eugenics in general. But it's important to understand that what we do know nowadays is also the result of historical and sociocultural developments. So again, it is impossible to completely separate the scientific enterprise from the norms, the ethics, the judgment of the sociocultural milieu at the time where these scientific studies were indeed performed. Now, the connection between different species and races and the connection with these concepts and ethnocultural subgroups are connected to, yet again, discussions on structure and function and purpose within neuroscience, more specifically within neuroanatomy. Now, to give an example, some researchers believe that certain anatomical features are a sign of cerebral organization moving toward a more human pattern. We're talking about the link between human and non-human animals, and this is the case of Ralph Holloway and the endocast of Australopithecus afarensis. While in other perspectives, according to other perspectives, think about Dean Falk, these perspectives suggest that these patterns, more specifically the position of the depression, are indicator of the lunate sulcus, similar to what is found in an ape-like sulcal pattern. So difference, similarities. Now, scientists are in agreement with some basic neurobiological aspects, of course, because that's where the research has led us to this point. But some scientists believe that similarities between skulls from different species could provide proof of relation, which could be justifying similarities in cognitive, emotional functions as well, and also as serving as the basis for perception, for self-identification, proprioceptic patterns, conceptualization of self, and identity. And so this is the continuation from last week's discussion in connection to animal modeling within neuroscience. Now, from this perspective, geometry, asymmetry, and or unevenness between the right and left hemisphere could indicate hemispherical specialization, which, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, could account for specific qualitative and quantitative differences in terms of emotions and behavior, as well as processing speed in computational cognitive terms. Let's mention just a few things regarding neurophysiology, because this is also a field connected to what we said so far. But let me just say that clinical neurophysiology is part of medicine as a field here in the United States, but it's an entirely separate field in many European countries. Now, by entirely separate, I mean from an academic educational perspective. Now, of course, everything is connection here. So to identify this connection, well, neurology contributes to a further understanding of disorder from a medical, scientific perspective. Neurophysiology studies the whole spectrum of neural function, including the physiology of neural function. Now, what type of research tools do we find here? We have molecular biology-based technology that are used in combination with imaging techniques, for instance, calcium imaging, electrophysiological recording, so patch and voltage clamp, but also field potential and single unit recording technologies, and optogenetics resources. For instance, we see EEG utilized to monitor brainwaves and compare their structure frequency for the evaluation of possible CNS abnormalities such as seizures. Nerve conduction studies are instead used to investigate a PNS and in combination with EMG to analyze muscles and nerves, while PSG is used for sleep studies. In this context, combination of electroencephalography, electromyography, and evoked potential are found in intraoperative neurophysiological monitoring, IONM, for instance, in somatosensory evoked potential, as TSEPs, transcranial Doppler imaging, or TCDI, transcranial electrical motor evoked potential, TCEMP, and many others. Now, neurophysiology is such a vast field that I will not make a list of all the scientists that contributed to it, but just a few names in this context. We mentioned Mondino de Liuzzi and Leonardo da Vinci. Perhaps the work by Niccolò Massa, the researcher at the Venetian College of Physicians on the cerebrospinal fluid and syphilis, is very, very important, historically speaking, as is the work by Fernelius, who was the first physician scientist to describe the spinal canal and actually to use the term physiology. Other famous names we can mention here is Jason Pratensis, Giulio Cesare Avanzio, Robert Burton, Vincenzo Malacarne, and Johann Webfel. Now, Malacarne is relevant to the history of medicine in general because he analyzed the cerebellum, which is connected to neuroscience in general, because Galvani observed the function of nerves and the reaction to electric impulses, and then Vic Dazier first and von Semmering after described the substantia nigra, and Portage studied the subiculum and lateral and medial geniculate bodies. Le Galois studied the medulla oblongata, and the Schwann cells got their name from, of course, the famous Dr. Schwann, another German physiologist. The last topic for this chapter is perhaps the best scientific connection between mind and body. So in a course on critical neuroscience, when we examine multiple aspects, specifically empirical one, laboratory-based, evidence-based, all the way to theoretical, philosophical, and social aspects, I would say that the next part of this chapter, the conclusion, the last subfield, or connected subfields in a plural, is in this sense the best explanation. I am talking about psychoneuroimmunology, psychobiology, and psychopharmacology. Now, in the context of psychopharmacology, of course, it is impossible to summarize all the psychopharmacological interventions in the context of psychiatry in a 15-week course. So in the textbook, you will find a brief examination in the form of a list of the most important, and by that I mean the most commonly prescribed modern psychotropic medications. And in this list, you find the distinction between antidepressants, antipsychotic, stimulants, and descriptors, labels such as mood stabilizer, anti-anxiety, anti-obsessive, and anti-panic agents. And this list includes both generic, international, as well as US brand names. So this will be for the brief examination of psychopharmacology. Within psychoneuroimmunology and psychobiology, I just want to mention a few things. Now, psychobiology is a term that is often used as a synonym for behavioral neuroscience, which we already analyzed when we talked about between psyche and mind, also in connection to affective neuroscience. But psychobiology describes the interaction between biological systems and behavior. Now, the focus is on the system-based processes, and I'm talking about the nervous system, that determines the mechanic basis of emotions, thoughts, and actions. Now, an elaboration of this point of view and methodological framework is indeed represented by psychoneuroimmunology. Now, this term was officially used in academia for the first time, at least in the Western world, by the psychologist Robert Adler and the immunologist Nicholas Cohen in the context of their studies on conditioning and immunosuppression. Thus, psychoneuroimmunology further develops the analysis on the connection between psyche and mind, and moves the attention onto the etiological and diagnostic aspects of mental, medical disorders and syndromes. And in this context, it's really important to understand how mind and body are connected, and is plenty of scientific evidence demonstrating this, thinking about somatized features, thinking about allergies, hypersensitivities, autoimmune disease, immune deficiencies, and intolerances overall. So the focus here on psychoneuroimmunology is really the biopsychosocial model and preventive medicine, preventive measure to foster effective health strategies and overall well-being. Now, I really encourage students to review some of the bibliographical references provided at the end of this chapter in the textbook. But I would like to mention just a few things here because psychoneuroimmunology is so important to understand the stress response, the HPA axis, this connection to psychophysical well-being. Think about studies by Hans Selye on the general adaptation syndrome, or studies by George Solomon on psychoimmunology. So at this point in our conversation, week 8, passing the midterm, halfway through the semester, if the question is, does mind affect the body? Does mind psychological processes, I dare to say spiritual processes, if by spirit we think about terms such as pneuma, vis vitalis, milieu intérieur, internal states, homeostasis, etc. Do these things, this concept, these processes influence our physical health? Does our mind influence our psychological state? Does our mind influence our body physiological processes? The answer is a yes, full stop. And there is plenty of scientific evidence to support this. What does it mean? Well, there is strong scientific evidence to support things such as meditation and prayer and mindfulness and integrative approaches to medicine. This is no longer up for debate. What it could be up for debate is maybe some misappropriation or misinterpretation of these practices and their specific role in preventive medicine. Another thing I want to mention in this context is there is extremely strong scientific evidence for the importance of emotions, understanding, empathy, I dare to say poetry and creativity for health and well-being. So I'm quite disappointed to see how there are still some people who have very unscientific claims within academia, I would say, or within how can I define this? Within a stereotypical image of academia. And the context is the presumed clash between liberal arts and STEM fields. Now, I just want to clarify that distinction between these two exists only in the United States. Maybe we could push that for some parts of the Anglo-Saxon academic world, but I feel that it's a distinction that really is a descriptor of the current situation in the US. Now, to classify liberal arts as opposed to STEM fields is, first of all, a demonstration of historical ignorance, and also a demonstration of the ignorance of very basic premises and application of the scientific method. Now, liberal arts, arti liberali, since the beginning of academia, since the very birth of universities, that in themselves are the connection between the Greco-Roman world and medieval Europe. Since the beginning, liberal arts included fields such as rhetoric, dialectics, so therefore logic, arithmetic, geometry, and of course, grammar, astronomy, and music. So to consider mathematics, for instance, to consider logic as a non-scientific field, it's completely unscientific of a statement. Now, there is this misappropriation of the term that liberal arts are either easier than STEM fields. And if I like to say something in this connection, we could just say that there will be no STEM fields without mathematics or logic to begin with, or they are a misrepresentation of what science is and should be. Well, this latter claim I would further address in the next week and the following one, so week 9 and 10, simply because we will talk about culture and the connection within neuroscience. But if there is this misinterpretation of liberal arts as either too emotional and less scientific, as if emotions and creativity are separate from science, well, this is both historically false and completely unscientific. Now, since we're talking about scientific evidence, you don't have to take my word for it, aside from the fact that the history is extremely clear. You just need to study it to see the role of emotions and creativity and rhetoric and logic as part of liberal arts for the scientific enterprise. I just want to mention a few things, because from the perspective of neuroscience, there are multiple studies that clearly indicate that the stress response is also mediated by the connection between emotions and empathy. Think about the mother-infant connection, the fact that human beings thrive when there is empathy, having the most potential neural growth of any species, and this mediation by this connection. It's important because mothers directly impact their baby's cortisol level by their reaction to internal and external stressors and related hormonal levels. More specifically, this reaction causes different responses in the modulatory ability of their children. Think about the research by Lyons and Ruth. Psychoneuroimmunology, psychobiology, and psychopharmacology are just some of the fields that provide clear scientific evidence for the importance of emotions. I also am very critical of certain claims that emotions, because of this connection with neural underpinnings of thoughts, behavior, and plasticity, can be reduced to neurochemical or neuroelectromagnetic components, as if they are not worthy in themselves. This is a very unscientific perspective that certain theoreticians would claim to be the ultimate truth. I also dare to say that some of these theoreticians, I think one name that just comes to mind is Yuval Harari, are in themselves not neuroscientists, and so they might misrepresent the way the scientific field actually is developed. But in any case, you don't have to pick and choose between emotion, poetry, and art, and science, logic, and math. We're talking about exactly the same thing, speaking multiple languages in this context. We mentioned this when we talked about embodied cognition and emotional intelligence and so on and so forth. I also want to clarify that because of all these factors, health fully depends on factors that directly influence biology and is, from a broad perspective, influenced by biology. So there is a connection, there is connectedness, there's connectivity with others. Another research that I often quote is the one by Candace Pert, that was able to demonstrate that neuropeptides and neurotransmitters directly impact the immune system, and that this system and the endocrine system are modulated by the entire central nervous system, so not only the brain but the whole CNS, and they are deeper connected to the processes involved, again, in emotions, cognitions, self-awareness, etc. Another research on neuroimmune interaction is the one by David Felton, and certain perspectives are more current on the enteric nervous system, the intrinsic nervous system, have to do with the so-called second brain and the function of gastroenteric neurotransmitters. Think about studies conducted by McConaughey, by Lisina Krause, by Lichkova, by Porro, and Gershon. Now, there are other things to keep in mind here. Connecting multiple systems and working on perspectives of immune alterations producing changes in behavior and vice versa, behaviorally induced changes to the immune system, directly help these disciplines to study the best medication strategies for the treatment of mental health disorders. So think about a deeper understanding of protein binding, half-life, polymorphic genes, and drug-to-drug interactions. Now, this again goes back to the complexity of behavioral aspects and the fact that, according to the Vickian expression, coscienza non è conoscenza.
Again, in this last part of this lecture, I want to mention one more thing. So we talked about the problems where we are forcing two empiricists, two materialists, to a mechanistic explanation for neurological processes and psychological processes. And this is, again, the issue that we just mentioned about psychiatry becoming increasingly neurologized in this sense. So we talk about the benefits and the mistakes of this more extreme view. But one of the quotes that I always like to mention to clarify this aspect is a quote by Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher, very famous Italian philosopher, and the quote says, "Coscienza non è conoscenza." So conscience, I would say even, it's not knowledge per se. Now, we have, of course, to separate conscience from consciousness, but the idea of a quantitative hierarchy that is responsible for a wakeful state, for instance, it's not in itself representative of knowledge. And this, again, goes back to this tripartite phenomenon that we discussed when we mentioned Aristotle, so techne, phronesis, and episteme. And it also has to do with perception. Now, this could in itself be yet again another semester alone to discuss that. And we will talk about perception in 2 weeks from now. But to give yet another example of the connection between neuroscience and medicine, specifically psychiatry, I just want to mention one of the most recent research studies that my team and I have published. And it's a research on olfactory virtual reality. A research that indicated, the results indicated, that there were benefits in the areas of stress, of pain perception, of mood changes, through the utilization of this device that stimulated the olfactory bulb, as well as the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, to promote an overall sense of relaxation and well-being. There is a specific playlist that discusses this research, but I would just like to mention just a few things in this lecture. And if you are interested in this type of research, please feel free to click on the provided link and find out more about olfactory virtual reality on the basis of this very recent research study that we published. Well, fantastic. This concludes week 8, so we officially passed the midterm. Next week we will continue on week 9 on brain culture and society, and this will provide yet another twist to the topics we are examining in this course. We will certainly move on to a more anthropological, cultural, and sociological analysis of neuroscience and related fields, and I hope you enjoy this new perspective, this new chapter in a figurative as well as in a very pragmatic sense of the term. So without further ado, let's say congratulations to all of you for reaching this milestone, passing the midterm, concluding week 8, and I will see you all next week. Bye bye.